Melania Trump sues Jasmine Crockett for $500 million claiming defamation. But Jasmine walks into court with nothing but the truth. Hidden contracts, a deleted email, and a silent speech flipped the case upside down. Melania wanted revenge. What she got was exposure. What happens when the accuser can't escape the truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lawsuit was filed swiftly and without warning. A civil complaint demanding $500 million in damages was submitted to the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., with Melania Trump listed as the plaintiff. The charge: defamation, reputational harm, and personal insult. The core of the complaint revolved around a single sentence Jasmine Crockett had spoken during a closed-door congressional hearing 3 weeks earlier. That sentence read, "She is the perfect emblem of luxurious dependency silence, traded for a seat on a throne built by someone else." According to Melania's attorneys, those 15 words weren't policy critique. They were a personal targeted attack meant to shame and belittle. In the official filing, Melania argued that the statement was deeply offensive and defamatory, accusing Crockett of deliberately undermining her public image as a former First Lady. Her legal team claimed the comment was crafted to ridicule Mrs. Trump's character, reduce her to an object of mockery, and damage the legacy she built during her time representing the United States on the world stage. The lawsuit emphasized that Melania had long maintained a dignified public role and that Crockett's words had maliciously portrayed her as a passive ornament rather than an independent woman of substance. Furthermore, the filing claimed the statement had international repercussions, damaging Melania's reputation with foreign institutions and philanthropic organizations. This was not political speech, her lawyers argued, but a calculated personal strike designed to provoke humiliation and destroy goodwill. They demanded full compensation for irreparable harm to dignity, reputation, and future opportunities. The $500 million figure was based on estimated long-term losses in image-based contracts, partnerships, and media influence. Melania herself signed the complaint. The proceedings were set to unfold in complete confidentiality. At the request of both parties, the court agreed to seal all early sessions and prohibit press access. No cameras, no reporters, no media leaks. What began as a sentence in a hearing room had now triggered one of the most high-stakes defamation battles in federal court, one that would play out behind closed doors between two women who understood the cost of silence and the price of speaking. But Melania wasn't the only one ready for war, and Jasmine Crockett had no plans to flinch. Before the courtroom lights ever flickered on, Jasmine sent in her official response. It wasn't flowery, it wasn't evasive, it was one page, and it was fire. I wasn't speaking about a person, she wrote. I was speaking about a pattern, the kind where women are turned into silent brands to protect the legacy of powerful men. No apology, no softening, just a clear shot back at the very foundation of the lawsuit. For Crockett, this wasn't about Melania's feelings. It was about a truth too many were too scared to say out loud, and the price women pay for pretending everything behind the curtain is noble and voluntary. That sentence, composed in plain type, stamped with her congressional seal, was more than a rebuttal. It was a declaration of position. It drew a clean line between symbolism and submission, between legacy and illusion. Jasmine wasn't attacking Melania's past. She was attacking the idea that silence equals grace, that decorum means complicity. Her words were surgical but not cruel. They were calculated, not reckless. She wasn't swinging wildly. She was pointing directly at a system that rewards pretty silence and punishes principled volume. And now that system had come to collect its debt with a lawsuit worth $500 million as leverage. Melania's legal team had hoped for something quieter, a formal statement, maybe a clarification, a few soft lines about regret and respect. They had even sent a mediator with an offer: settle out of court issue, a private retraction, and let the case dissolve before it ignited. But Jasmine's attorney, Marcia Tillman, didn't entertain it for a second. She slid the offer back across the table without touching it. "We don't settle with shadows," she said without raising her voice. It wasn't posturing. It was a promise. What Melania thought would be a fast legal silencing was about to become a forensic dissection of what silence really costs and who benefits from it. Instead of backing down, Jasmine's team filed a formal notice of intent. They would defend every word, every syllable, with dates, memos, testimony, and records that went far beyond opinion. They weren't coming to survive the courtroom. They were coming to expose it. Jasmine wasn't just fighting to defend a sentence. She was fighting to defend the right to name what others only hint at the polished choreography of power marriage branding and calculated silence that shaped Melania's public image for over a decade. And when the day finally came, the silence broke not with noise but with presence. The courtroom doors opened at 9:00 a.m. sharp. Melania Trump entered, first draped in an all-black pantsuit, the fabric sharp, structured, unforgiving. Her eyes scanned the room like steel, not searching, but judging. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. Her presence alone demanded deference. Jasmine Crockett followed minutes later, wearing a plain navy blazer, hair pulled back, no jewelry, no makeup beyond what the lights required. She looked like someone who didn't come to perform, she came to fight. Neither woman looked at the other, but the tension between them was loud enough to hum. No reporters, no cameras, just the quiet sound of history tightening its grip around the air. The room settled into a charged stillness as Judge Rowan entered. The gavel tapped once. No cameras, no press pool, but the room felt watched by history itself. Melania's attorney rose, his voice clipped, rehearsed and loaded with measured outrage. A woman who once represented this country with dignity and grace, he began, has been reduced to a punchline by a hostile member of Congress whose words were not only unfounded, but personal. His hands didn't tremble. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every phrase was sharpened to sting without spectacle. He spoke of reputational wounds, of deliberate public shaming, of a legacy sabotaged under the guise of commentary. Then he turned, paused just long enough to let silence sharpen the air, and said, "This isn't political commentary. It's targeted humiliation, fueled by ego and bitterness." Marcia Tillman stood calmly like someone familiar with firestorms. Her voice was quiet, not soft, not submissive, but firm, intentional, and piercing in its steadiness. "We don't mock," she said. "We describe." Then she paused. The stillness in the room thickened. She turned her head slightly toward the judge and continued. "And what we described was what millions of Americans witnessed over 4 years, a carefully curated image of obedience, presented as elegance, and backed by a man who demanded loyalty over voice." Her words didn't rise, but they rang. No metaphors, no flourishes, just truth clean and sharpened like the edge of a sealed envelope. She stepped closer to the bench, locked eyes with the judge, and delivered the final line like a verdict. "This case isn't about restoring reputation. It's about punishing someone who noticed the truth and dared to name it." No one moved. The air throbbed with a quiet weight that clung to the ceiling and sank into the floor. Chairs didn't shift. Pens didn't scribble. The moment hung like glass, perfectly still, but one breath away from shattering. On one side sat a woman known for never speaking out, and on the other, a woman known for never backing down. And between them, a courtroom that now knew neither one had come to lose. The silence that followed was short-lived because Jasmine Crockett didn't come to trade metaphors. She came to lay down facts. She stood with quiet force, her fingertips resting on a thick black binder she hadn't touched until now. With one smooth motion, she opened it and drew out 3 folders, each marked with a single date, clean, simple, and deadly. Her heels didn't move. Her voice didn't shake. She handed the papers to the clerk, then looked straight at the judge. "These are internal records obtained through legal channels," she said, calm but cutting. "Each one speaks to a pattern of intentional silence, crafted and enforced by design, not dignity." The room didn't shift, but the air inside it did. The tone changed. Suddenly, this wasn't about what Jasmine had said. It was about what Melania had signed. The first document was a signed agreement, a formal contract between Melania Trump and a private media consulting firm she had retained just weeks after the 2016 election. Jasmine pointed the judge to a specific clause in bold. It read, "The client agrees not to issue independent statements on matters of policy governance or political opinion without prior review and approval from campaign-aligned counsel." There was no legal jargon to hide behind, no vague phrasing. It meant exactly what it sounded like. Melania Trump had legally promised not to say anything that might conflict with Donald Trump's political messaging. Her thoughts were not her own, not in interviews, not on stage, not in passing conversation. That wasn't discretion. That was enforced silence, and it was signed in ink. The second document made that silence even louder. It was Melania's internal media schedule from her time in the White House, a week-by-week breakdown of her public appearances. Jasmine didn't read it. She didn't have to. The printed highlights were enough. Every quote attributed to Melania had been pre-written. Her talking points, her greetings, even her off-the-cuff remarks were written days in advance by Trump's communications team. One directive read, "Avoid any unscripted answers. Stick to approved lines only." Another flagged topics like immigration and gender equity as too volatile. Do not engage. Jasmine looked back up at the bench. Every word she spoke was ghost-written, she said. This wasn't quiet elegance, it was broadcast choreography. That line didn't echo. It sank. Then came the third file, a typed memo written by a former aide now no longer with Melania's team. It was the shortest document, but the most human. It recounted a moment from a planning meeting when Melania had been asked to speak at an event celebrating women's rights. The memo recorded her response exactly as it was spoken. "Donald doesn't like me talking politics. I just need to show up." There was no interpretation, no spin, just one sentence from Melania herself, plain and painful. Jasmine didn't offer commentary. She didn't need to. That line said more about Melania's role than any critic ever could. Judge Rowan adjusted her glasses, leaned forward slightly, and addressed the clerk. "Have these signatures been independently verified?" she asked, her voice clipped and clear. Jasmine replied, "They will be if permitted." The moment froze. Across the aisle, Melania's lead attorney stood, his voice tight with restraint, and requested a delay in proceedings to authenticate the records. But it was too clean, too late, too transparent. Judge Rowan stared straight ahead. "Motion denied," she said. "We proceed." And with that, the dam cracked. What Melania had tried to frame as defamation had just become documentation. Her silence wasn't noble. It was negotiated, coordinated, and monetized. And now, for the first time, it was officially part of the record. The judge's denial echoed like a vault slamming shut, a soundless impact that sent a ripple through the courtroom. It was the kind of moment you didn't clap for, didn't gasp at, but felt in your spine. And then, for the first time since the proceedings began, something shifted behind Melania Trump's eyes. Pride, maybe, or pressure finally pushing through the armor. Either way, she stood. Not quickly, not gracefully. She rose with the kind of deliberate motion that made it clear this wasn't about rules or legal rhythm, it was about control. The subtle flutter of her jacket sleeve betrayed the tight grip she had on her own wrists. A breath caught in her throat before the words came, and when they did, they cut through the courtroom like a shard of glass. "She doesn't know anything about my life," Melania said, her voice cool but brittle, as if each word had to fight past clenched teeth. "I chose silence out of respect for my husband. No one forced me." The sentence hung in the air longer than it should have, because everyone in that room, from the judge to the clerk to her own attorneys, knew it wasn't just a denial. It was a defense of something far deeper than the lawsuit, the very architecture of her image. She was trying to pull it back together with 7 words, but they didn't land like bricks. They landed like excuses. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't answer. She didn't even blink. Instead, she calmly reached into the slim, unmarked folder on the desk in front of her and drew out a single photograph. She didn't hold it up dramatically. She didn't explain. She simply stepped forward, handed it to the bailiff, and returned to her seat. The image passed from hand to hand until it reached the bench. And when it did, the temperature in the room dropped. The photo was dated March 5th, 2020. It showed Melania Trump descending the back steps of the White House, dressed in a navy coat and carrying a thin leather folio. The caption beneath it, taken from a headline, scrubbed clean within 48 hours of posting, read, "First Lady cancels appearance in Ukraine, speech reportedly finalized, then pulled." The story had quietly disappeared. The visit had been on every internal schedule until the very last minute. Melania was supposed to attend a humanitarian summit, deliver a brief but high-profile speech on women's rights in post-conflict regions, and meet with local organizers on the ground. But she never made it to the plane. The photo was clean and undeniable, but it was what came next that detonated the room. Without a word, Jasmine handed over a second document, an internal email chain, printed and time-stamped, sent between top advisors in the Trump campaign's communications division. It had been labeled urgent, and in the subject line, Ukraine visual risk, FLOTUS appearance. The body of the email was short, direct, and cold-blooded. Recommend Mrs. Trump be withdrawn from Ukraine visit. This situation does not benefit from a female visual. Messaging risk high. No euphemisms, no diplomacy, just a calculated erasure of Melania's presence because her gender didn't serve the narrative. They didn't even refer to her as a person. She was a visual, an accessory, a piece to be included or excluded based solely on how it looked next to the brand of the man she'd married. Jasmine didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The silence now was different from the ones before, not tense, but exposed. Every inch of the courtroom could feel it. The truth wasn't just floating in the air. It was pinned to the walls. Framed in that photo, etched into that email, it was all right there. Melania hadn't chosen silence. She had been chosen for silence. Melania's posture cracked. It wasn't visible at first, but her shoulder dropped. Her eyes blinked too long. She shifted her weight to her left heel, then sat down, not lowered, not eased, but dropped like something let go. Her body made a soft thud against the leather chair, but the sound might as well have been thunder. And in that single motion, the narrative unraveled. She had stood to reclaim control. But now, for the first time in the entire trial, Melania Trump looked smaller than the myth that had been built around her. She had insisted she wasn't forced, that she was silent by choice, that her absence from the political stage was dignified, not dictated. But the proof on the judge's bench told another story, and this time it didn't need a voice to be heard. No one in the room said anything. Not her lawyers, not the court reporter. Even the judge kept her hands still, as if moving might shatter the moment. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy, it was recognition. Everyone in that room now understood what Jasmine Crockett had been trying to say from the beginning, not about Melania as a woman, but about a system that dresses submission in silk and calls it respectability. Melania's attorneys leaned in, whispering something, but she didn't respond. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her jaw clenched tight. Her eyes didn't rise to meet the judge. Not this time. Whatever she might have said, whatever rebuttal she had rehearsed, it was buried now beneath 2 pages of photo and a sentence that no one could unsee. This situation does not benefit from a female visual. And there it was, the truth behind the pageantry, the calculation behind the curated grace. A woman not praised for what she said, but used precisely because she didn't say anything at all. And now in this courtroom, her silence had finally become a witness, not for her defense, but against the image she had spent years preserving. No ruling had been made. No verdict had been read. But in that instant, the balance of the trial shifted irreversibly, not with shouting, not with fireworks, just with a photograph, an email, and a sentence that proved more devastating than any accusation ever could. Jasmine hadn't dismantled Melania's reputation. She'd simply held up a mirror and let the truth do the rest. The courtroom had already felt tense, but now it turned still. After the photograph, the email, and the audible collapse of a crafted public image, most people expected a closing statement or a final rebuke. But Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't offer drama. Instead, she delivered something far more dangerous: clarity. She stood again, only this time it wasn't to reveal another piece of paper. Her hands were empty. Her voice was soft but unmistakably firm, the calm before the moral hammer dropped. She looked at the judge, not at Melania, and asked just one thing. If a person is forced into silence, Jasmine began, each word clean and measured, living by a media contract, not allowed to speak against directives, then tell me, Your Honor, is it wrong to call that luxurious dependency? The words fell like a stone into deep water. No echo, just weight. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a slogan. It was a question built on everything that had been laid bare. The contracts, the silencing, the email that erased her from a war visit because her image might not benefit the narrative. Jasmine didn't need to add a single word more. The room had already absorbed the meaning. Every face from the interns to the clerk was locked onto the bench now, waiting not for an argument, but for a reckoning. The judge sat still for a long moment, lips pressed together. She leaned back just slightly, her fingers steepled at her chest. Then eyes slowly shifting to Melania, her voice returned quiet but decisive. Mrs. Trump, she said you have not been able to refute that description as false. What Ms. Crockett said may be uncomfortable. It may even be painful. But this lawsuit is driven by emotion, not defamation. There is no legal basis for slander. The silence after that wasn't the kind that demanded reflection. It was the kind that declared an ending. The sound of finality. The weight of truth reaching the last page. Melania didn't stand this time. She stayed seated, her back still straight, but the sharpness in her eyes had faded into something murkier, like a painting losing color in real time. Her lawyer, pale and sweating, now leaned toward her and whispered fast. She didn't respond. Then slowly her manicured fingers reached across the table. A single page was slid toward her, the official form to withdraw her $500 million civil defamation suit. She signed. No ceremony, no denial, just ink. The judge watched her closely, then nodded once to the clerk. The gavel didn't drop yet, but the room already knew it was over. Officially or not, Jasmine Crockett had won. Not just legally, not just politically, but morally in the only way that mattered in a room like this. Melania Trump had withdrawn her lawsuit, but it was too late. She had initiated the war of image and silence, and in doing so, she had allowed the very silence she clung to become the star witness against her. What had started as a $500 million play to silence a congresswoman had ended with the courtroom exposing line by line how silence had never been a choice. It had been an assignment, an agreement, a costume worn so long the world mistook it for identity. Melania's lawyers sat motionless now. They had nothing left to salvage. They had walked into the courtroom with one goal: to force an apology extract, a retraction, rewrite one woman's words. Instead, they had watched that woman defend those words with receipts, restraint, and something far more terrifying than anger: truth. Jasmine didn't move as Melania signed. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She stood still, not as a victor, but as a mirror one that had forced an entire courtroom to look at something they had been told never to name. And in the reflection, they hadn't seen a slanderer. They had seen a whistleblower, a truth-teller, a woman who called a cage what it was even when it was gold-plated, silk-lined, and protected by $500 million. The silence held not awkward, not confused, but awestruck. In the end, Melania's silence wasn't what lost her the case. It was the world finally realizing that it had never been her voice. The silence in the courtroom had weight now, not the quiet of politeness, but the silence that follows when something irreversible is about to be spoken. Every breath hung suspended as the judge leaned slightly forward, not with dramatics, but with precision. She had listened. She had watched. And now her voice struck not as a sound, but as a verdict etched into stone. This court finds Representative Jasmine Crockett not guilty, she declared. The words landed not just on the record, but in the air, loud enough to drown every unspoken threat that had hovered between the two women for weeks. Her tone was neither hesitant nor cruel, it was final, cold and clean like steel. She paused for only half a second, enough to let the ripple begin in the hearts of everyone seated in that room. Then she continued, her tone sharpened with authority. This lawsuit is not a pursuit of justice. It is a misuse of the legal system, an attempt to punish free speech through civil intimidation. The impact was immediate. Jasmine sat motionless, eyes forward, her expression unreadable. But there was a tension in her shoulders that finally quietly began to uncoil. Melania, dressed in shadowy black, didn't flinch. She just blinked slowly, her jaw tightening ever so slightly, as if her grip on the narrative she thought she controlled had slipped from her fingers in front of a room that would never forget. And then the ruling twisted like a blade. Furthermore, the judge said, her voice growing firmer with each syllable, "This court finds sufficient grounds to issue a counter-ruling. Ms. Trump shall pay $500 million in damages to Representative Crockett. The charges include defamation through false legal accusation, public character assassination via official records, and deliberate sabotage of a sitting congresswoman's political standing." No gasp, no outcry, just stillness so absolute it felt physical. A beat passed, then another. Melania's lawyers went pale, like surgeons realizing the incision they made had cut too deep. Her lead counsel scribbled something, then stopped. What was there left to write? The room had already closed in on itself. What was once a stage for Melania's vengeance had become the courtroom where her silence had been dissected, exposed, and ultimately judged. The $500 million figure didn't feel like a fine. It felt like a reckoning. Not for something Jasmine said, but for everything Melania had tried to hide behind the myth of dignity. The damages weren't just monetary, they were symbolic. For the years of complicity, for the misuse of power, for trying to weaponize shame and law against a woman who refused to bow. Melania's hands were no longer resting calmly. They gripped the wooden edge of the table, now white-knuckled, not from fear, but from a stunned disbelief that refused to settle. She opened her mouth slightly as if to respond, but the words never came. Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't need to. The judge did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The verdict had done all the shouting. With one final glance at both parties, she said the only words that remained: "Court is adjourned." There was no gavel, no theatrical bang. Just the quiet shuffling of chairs as the weight of what had just happened spread through every corner of the sealed room. No reporters, no flashing lights, no leaks. But every official in attendance knew they had just witnessed something no NDA or PR statement could spin. Melania Trump hadn't simply lost a lawsuit, she had lost the story. The aftershock didn't roar, it crept in with silence, precision, and consequence. In the hours following the courtroom bombshell, the institutions that once stood behind Melania Trump began to quietly retreat. The ruling hadn't just invalidated her legal assault, it had punctured the illusion that she was untouchable. And in elite circles, perception was power. Now her image was no longer a crown, it was a risk. By midday, Melania's public relations team began receiving short clip notices from corporate sponsors and media partners. One cable network executive who had once gushed about her modern dignity sent a 2-sentence termination. Effective immediately, all cooperative segments are on hold. Further involvement will require legal clearance. No explanation, no apology, just an elegant door closing. The sheen of her former brand had dulled into controversy, and no network wanted their logo splashed across that unraveling narrative. Behind closed doors, the cracks spread wider. 2 top aides' names that had graced glossy magazine profiles beside hers submitted formal resignations within an hour of each other. They gave no interviews. There were no goodbye cakes or quiet farewells, just folders packed up and a final tense nod to the front desk. One of them was overheard muttering, "You can't keep defending someone who weaponized silence." To staffers still in shock from the verdict, those words stung more than any headline. But the most surgical blow came not from TV or tabloids, it came from the donors. They didn't march, they didn't shout, they asked questions, dangerous ones. Several high-value contributors to her philanthropic fund began demanding internal memos and campaign disclosures. They wanted to know exactly how their contributions had been used and whether the marriage image that once drew their trust had been a crafted facade. One joint letter signed by 3 longtime GOP donors was blunt. "We request full clarification regarding the public-private overlap between marital symbolism and campaign utility. Are we supporting personal legacy or political fiction? In other words, prove that your presence wasn't just branding." The fallout reached its peak with a quiet memo issued from inside Trump's 2024 campaign headquarters. No press release, no cameras. Just an internal message circulated to senior staff with chilling clarity: Melania Trump would no longer serve in a public engagement capacity for the campaign. Her official title, Public Liaison Chair, was stripped without fanfare. The memo cited strategic communication realignment, but even junior staffers understood what that really meant: she was out. Not punished, not disavowed, just erased. Like a statue quietly moved from the lobby into storage when the guests start asking too many questions. In staff meetings, no one dared say her name, but the shift was unmistakable. Her image had once been a political asset, calm, poised, untouched by the firestorms that consumed others. But after the ruling, that silence no longer read as grace. It read as surrender, or worse, strategy. Now she was no longer the face of grace under pressure. She was the echo of a lost campaign promise, one that even her closest allies no longer wanted to repeat. But while Melania's world quietly unraveled behind velvet curtains and closed conference doors, Jasmine Crockett's next move caught everyone off guard, not for what it was, but for what it wasn't. No podium, no cameras, No parade of legal analysts or morning show exclusives. Though she had every legal and political right to step into the spotlight and declare victory, Jasmine chose silence. Not the kind that cowers, but the kind that cuts deeper than a headline. In the hours following the courtroom's seismic ruling, she didn't linger in D.C. to bask in the aftermath. She boarded a modest flight home to Texas, alone. No entourage, no press releases, just her laptop, her legal pads, and a stack of handwritten notes about a housing bill she had been drafting before the lawsuit even started. She returned not to fanfare, but to function. Her office lights were on before sunrise the next morning. Aides who expected tears champagne or at least a minute of celebration instead found her asking, has the committee chair confirmed the oversight hearing date? It was as if the lawsuit had never happened. As if $500 million and the humiliation of a former first lady had been some background noise she'd learned to work through. For Jasmine, the win didn't mean she had conquered something. It meant she hadn't been distracted from what mattered. Later that week, she walked into a small community town hall in East Dallas. No fanfare, no national media. Just folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, and 30 constituents who had signed up to ask questions. The air buzzed with quiet reverence, but also curiosity. People had seen the headlines even if they didn't talk about them out loud. They had watched clips of the courtroom's silence, the ruling, the image of Jasmine standing without flinching as Melania sank into her chair. But no one brought it up until a retired school teacher in the back stood slowly gripping the microphone with both hands. His voice cracked with a mix of admiration and discomfort. Can I ask something not on the agenda? The room stilled. Jasmine didn't blink. She nodded. The man exhaled and asked the question everyone had carried in their chest but couldn't bring to their lips. How did it feel? Making Mrs. Trump look so small. For a full second, Jasmine didn't speak. She just looked at the man, then at the room. And when she finally answered, it wasn't with the fury of a courtroom rebuttal or the precision of a practiced press quote. It was soft, unshakable, clear as bone. I didn't make anyone look small, she said. I didn't embarrass anyone. She paused, letting the weight settle. I didn't break a woman. I broke a mold. The room didn't erupt. It breathed deep, collective, reverent, like they had just watched a sword pulled from stone. Her words weren't crafted for applause. They were carved from experience. And in that moment, everyone understood Jasmine wasn't just talking about Melania. She was talking about every image ever built to keep women quiet, polished, obedient. She was talking about the cages wrapped in velvet, the crowns that doubled as muzzles, the silence sold as grace. The school teacher nodded, slowly, then sat down. Jasmine looked back at her notes, shifted the conversation toward urban housing reform, and never mentioned the lawsuit again. But something had shifted in the room. Something had shifted far beyond it. She had dismantled not just a legal argument, but a cultural myth. And she'd done it without raising her voice, without seeking revenge, and without becoming the thing she was accused of, a symbol of anger. No, Jasmine had become something else entirely, a symbol of refusal. Refusal to play the game. Refusal to glorify quiet suffering. Refusal to back down just because her voice made the powerful uncomfortable. And in choosing to walk away from the noise, she had said something louder than any press release ever could. Victory doesn't need a microphone. It just needs to be undeniable. The quiet aftermath of the courtroom storm had rippled outward, shifting not only political alliances, but cultural expectations. Jasmine Crockett had returned to Texas not to bask, but to build. Yet as the dust settled and her silence echoed louder than any headline, the nation took notice. Not just of the ruling, but of her, the woman who refused to flinch, refused to celebrate, and refused to reduce victory to a soundbite. That refusal made history want more. And so 2 weeks later, the invitation came. It arrived not in a glossy envelope, but as a direct call from the Speaker's office. Would Representative Jasmine Crockett consider delivering the closing remarks at the upcoming Congressional Summit on Women in Power? The timing was no accident. The summit, typically a ceremonial gathering of bipartisan pleasantries, had suddenly taken on teeth in the wake of Melania's courtroom defeat. For years, the event had showcased sanitized speeches about progress and glass ceilings, but Jasmine had just shattered something more insidious, the silent contract behind the crown. She accepted. not to settle scores, but to sharpen truths. The chamber was filled that morning. Senators, aides, international press, and nonprofit leaders packed every seat. The tension wasn't hostile, it was electric. Everyone knew the subtext. The audience didn't come for another hollow celebration of token representation. They came because a woman who had walked through the fire and didn't burn was about to speak. Jasmine didn't wear power heels. She didn't step onto the stage in designer armor. She wore a simple navy blue suit. No makeup flourishes, no golden pins. Her voice when it came through the mic didn't tremble, but it carried the weight of something ancient finally being named. She didn't start with thank yous. She started with reality. There's a strange silence. She began locking eyes with no one and everyone at once that wraps itself around powerful women in America. A silence dressed up as elegance, a silence bought with PR contracts and carefully filtered photo ops. A silence that's mistaken for loyalty, but smells a lot more like fear. She paused, not for effect, but for clarity. And here's the thing, she continued. When women are silenced, not with duct tape, but with praise and gowns and curated appearances, then democracy doesn't just suffer. It becomes a lie dressed for dinner, gasps, some subtle, some not. Even the seasoned ones in the room shifted in their seats. Cameras didn't flash. No one dared move. Then she said the sentence that would be etched into the congressional record as a turning point in modern civic discourse. When women are silenced by pretty dresses and media contracts, then politics is no longer democratic. It wasn't shouted. It was delivered like a verdict. The room didn't applaud. Not yet. They just sat in it like a courtroom holding its breath for the gavel to drop. Jasmine let the silence stretch, the good kind of silence, the kind that meant truth had found no opposition. She then shared something quieter, but no less deadly. Do you know how many women I've met who weren't allowed to speak, not because they didn't want to, but because their role was decoration, not disruption? Do you know how many times the phrase, "not the right optics," has shut down something real and urgent and brave? She didn't name Melania. She didn't have to. This wasn't about one woman. It was about a system, a machine. And Jasmine wasn't here to oil its gears. She was here to call it by name and let the damn thing rust in the sunlight. In every generation, we inherit not just laws, but roles, she said. We're told how power looks on a woman, how she should sound, how she should sit, whether her voice cracks, whether her eyes are too loud. And God forbid if her voice cuts sharper than the men's, then suddenly she's too much. The women in the room straightened. Some clenched fists, others wiped tears without shame. Jasmine stood still. No woman should have to trade her truth for a title. No woman should be punished because she refused to bow before the theater of obedience. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, then good. Comfort has never changed a damn thing. That line broke the room open. Applause erupted, not polite, not timed, but raw. A standing ovation surged from the chamber floor like a dam breaking. Some lawmakers didn't rise, most did, but all watched. Watched a woman not groomed for the moment, but built for it, step down from the podium with no smile, no fist pump, no pretense. Only grace, only power. As she exited, someone whispered to a reporter near the door. That wasn't a speech. That was a reckoning. And they were right, because Jasmine didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for every woman ever asked to be pretty, but silent. Present, but empty. Polished, but powerless. In a town known for spin, she had just dropped an anchor. And history for once refused to look away. But sometimes the most powerful words aren't the ones said on stage, they're the ones written into law. As applause faded and Jasmine returned to the grind of committee schedules, policy briefs, and hallway votes, her focus sharpened. The courtroom victory had made a cultural dent, but she knew better than to mistake attention for protection. Because even now in the halls of Congress, the weaponization of lawsuits, frivolous, retaliatory, and chilling, was alive and well. What happened to her could happen again, and next time the target might not have a microphone or the strength to fight back. That thought lit the fuse. So just weeks after the Melania trial, Jasmine Crockett did something more lasting than headlines. She went to work, quietly, intentionally. Behind closed doors, she began drafting legislation that many would later call radical, but which in truth was simply overdue. Her goal was simple: to make sure no elected official could be dragged into court just for saying the truth unless there was clear malicious intent. She wasn't alone. A small but growing group of representatives across parties, genders, and ideologies had witnessed how defamation law was being twisted into a silencing tool. They'd seen whistleblowers threaten truth-tellers sued, and public servants like Jasmine forced to defend their integrity in courtrooms instead of Congress. It wasn't just unconstitutional, it was corrosive. So when Jasmine stood in a closed-door subcommittee and said, "We're not passing a shield for cowards. We're creating a firewall for free speech," the room listened. The bill was drafted over 3 weeks. Dense in legal language, yet sharp in intent, it focused on one narrow but vital principle: if a sitting member of Congress makes a statement related to public policy or oversight, and there's no clear, provable malice, then they cannot be sued for defamation. It didn't protect lies, it protected purpose. Jasmine made sure of that. She read every clause, edited every footnote, fought for every word. When her co-author, Representative Caleb Diaz of Oregon, jokingly asked, "You sure you want to name it after her," referring to the high-profile defendant from the now infamous trial, Jasmine didn't even blink. "She named it for me the moment she sued," Jasmine said without raising her voice. "We're just returning the favor." And so it was born, the Civic Expression Protection Act. But no one on the Hill called it that. Not the interns, not the staffers, not the press. They called it what everyone knew it was: the Melania Clause. The nickname stuck like wildfire, and Jasmine didn't stop it. She didn't gloat. She didn't tweet. But behind that calm exterior, she knew exactly what it meant. The same name once used to diminish her, whispered in smears, printed in court filings, dragged through talk show ridicule, was now etched into a defense of democracy. When she introduced the bill formally on the House floor, she didn't shout or grandstand. She simply opened her remarks with, "This bill isn't about winning a personal feud. It's about making sure no woman or man who swears an oath to protect the Constitution is punished for doing just that." And with that, she walked through the logic. She explained how defamation law had become a sword, not a shield. She pointed to real cases: journalists, mayors, teachers who'd been sued into silence for exposing corruption. She cited the chilling effects such lawsuits had on investigative oversight. She reminded them that public service requires public courage, and that courage dies when fear walks into the courtroom with better lawyers. Not once did she say Melania's name, but the chamber heard her loud and clear. Opposition came fast, but not smart. Some lawmakers barked about accountability and abuse. Jasmine nodded, then calmly pointed them to Section 4 of the bill, the clause that specifically excluded protections for reckless falsehoods or personal vendettas. If you lie on purpose, she said, you still get sued. But if you speak the truth with duty and conviction, you should be protected. Every line in her voice was cut from experience. Every point in her argument had been lived. Outside the chamber, the press latched on like moths to flame. "The Melania Clause, controversial or common sense," read one headline. "Jasmine Crockett strikes again, this time in the law books," read another. But Jasmine wasn't reading coverage. She was reading vote counts. And slowly, as hearings advanced and testimony rolled in, from law professors, speech advocates, even retired judges, the momentum built. The bill started as a whisper. It grew into a statement, then into a stand. And Jasmine knew exactly what was at stake, not just for her, but for the next woman who dared to challenge a former first lady, the next congressman who called out corporate fraud, the next voice of dissent who wouldn't back down because someone richer decided to call them a liar. In a quiet interview with a Texas radio station, she was asked, "If you had to sum up why you did this, what would you say?" She didn't pause, because if they can sue a sitting member of Congress for calling out power, then they can sue any American for telling the truth. And I'm not here to protect myself, I'm here to protect the next truth teller who can't afford a lawyer. That quote would later be printed on the first page of the bill's public summary, not because it was poetic, because it was exactly what the country needed to hear. And Jasmine, she never looked back. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't launch a podcast. She just wrote the next bill. But in that one piece of legislation, in that one unofficial name, a whole nation learned what real power sounds like when it's not afraid to speak. And just when the headlines began to fade, when the noise of political triumph quieted into the rhythm of ordinary governance, It arrived not with a gavel, not with applause, but with a whisper. A plain envelope, no return address, no logo. Just a name, Reper Jasmine Crockett, scrawled in block letters and slipped into a Friday mail pile at her Capitol Hill office. Her staff almost tossed it in the crank bin, the stack of angry screeds and threats every outspoken congressperson gets. But something about the handwriting made her chief of staff pause. It was careful, not neat, not frantic, just intentional. He slid it into Jasmine's folder without a word. That night, after a long day of hearings and backroom meetings, she opened it alone. No fanfare, no cameras, just a chair, a desk lamp, and a hand reaching for truth. Inside was a single sheet of unlined paper, folded twice, written in pen. I also signed one of those silence contracts. Mine was with a man whose name you'd recognize, though I hope you never have to. Thank you for speaking for those of us who still can't. You didn't just defend yourself. You defended the rest of us. Keep going, please. There was no signature, no clue where it came from, no request for a reply. But Jasmine sat frozen eyes locked on the words like they were still warm from the pen. For a full minute, she didn't move, didn't blink, just read it again, and again, and again. The letter didn't accuse, it didn't beg, it simply existed as a quiet fragment of a world most people never see. A world where power silences contracts erase consent, and speaking up means losing everything. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about the case. It was about the unspoken army women and men living with their truths buried under signatures. And that's when it hit her. She had won in court. She had held her ground in Congress. She had helped pass a bill that changed the rules. But this was the moment that mattered. She folded the letter slowly, carefully, like it was glass. Then, without ceremony, slid it into the leather wallet she carried daily, right behind her ID. Not for display, not for drama, but because she needed to feel it near her heart. A physical reminder that this fight was never about being seen. It was about seeing others who couldn't be. The next morning, when a colleague jokingly said, "You finally shut Melania up," Jasmine didn't smile. She just replied, "That was never the point." Because it wasn't. It never had been. From the first insult on live television to the final gavel drop in court, Jasmine knew the real battlefield wasn't image, it was intention. It was about whether the truth had room to breathe in public life or whether it could be bought packaged and gagged by those with more money and fewer morals. And that letter, it was proof the battle wasn't just theoretical, it was personal. It belonged to someone out there still living inside a contract, still walking through life pretending silence is strength, still wondering if anyone anywhere would ever believe their story. Jasmine didn't need to know their name. She already knew their pain. She had worn it like armor for months through interrogations, mockery, late-night doubt, and quiet tears that never reached the news cameras. And now that pain was no longer hers alone. It had a voice, a shared breath, a small handwritten truth that refused to stay buried. That week during a closed strategy session, a senior advisor asked her, "Do you want us to go public with the Melania clause, Victory, do a press tour? Book the Sunday shows?" Jasmine shook her head. "The law's been passed. Let it speak for itself." The room fell quiet. No one pushed back, because everyone who had worked beside her on the bill, who had seen what she endured, understood one thing about Jasmine Crockett. She didn't fight to be famous. She fought because someone had to. Days later, at a community town hall in Dallas, an older woman with silver braids and a navy church dress approached her with watery eyes and whispered, "You said what I couldn't say for 20 years. I wish I had your courage." Jasmine held her hand gently, looked her in the eye and replied, "Then you just gave me more of it." Moments like that didn't make the news, but they made the mission. Because it wasn't about dragging former first ladies into the spotlight. It wasn't about clapping back going viral or scoring political points. It was about reclaiming space for dignity for every silenced person whose truth had been locked behind ironclad clauses and gold-trimmed shame. And for Jasmine, that letter in her wallet became a compass. When she felt herself drifting into exhaustion, she'd touch it. When the cameras got too bright or the headlines too loud, or the whisper campaigns too cruel, she'd remember. This was never about proving herself. It was about protecting someone else's chance to survive. One night flying back to Texas alone, she pulled the letter out again, midair. The plane cabin was dark, everyone else asleep. She didn't read it this time. Just held it pressed between her fingers like a secret vow. And in the hum of the engines, she whispered to herself, not for glory, for those who can't. Back on the ground, her work continued. No victory parade, no CNN special, just legislative grind district meetings and hearings on rights that barely made the news. But now every time someone asked her why she kept going, why she didn't rest or cash in or move on, she didn't have to explain. The letter explained it for her. She kept it safe, worn, creased, quiet, but always with her. Because in a world where power still demands silence and money still buys silence, contracts Jasmine Crockett had chosen to carry something louder. A voice not her own, a message from the margins, a thank you from the shadows. And in that simple act of holding it close and letting it guide her, she had answered the question history would one day ask, did anyone speak for the voiceless? And the answer tucked inside her wallet was yes. And as the echoes of history softened into the stillness of resolution, a different kind of silence filled the courthouse, a silence not of suppression but of understanding. Jasmine had stood alone against a system that too often rewarded quiet obedience and punished inconvenient truths. Now the dust had settled. The judgments had been made. But what lingered wasn't just the verdict, it was the echo of a choice that thousands before her had never been allowed to make. For Jasmine Crockett, the victory wasn't about walking out with a legal win. It was about walking out with her soul intact. The hallway outside the courtroom was empty. No cheering crowd, no flashing cameras. Just marble columns, dim lighting, and the slow, deliberate sound of her heels on stone, like a heartbeat returning to rhythm after a long, brutal interruption. Her staff walked behind her, quiet, unsure whether to speak. Some carried boxes, others carried laptops. But Jasmine carried something else. Conviction. It weighed nothing and everything all at once. At the foot of the courthouse steps, she paused not for effect, not for photos, but to breathe, to feel the moment for what it truly was, a breaking of the mold, a refusal to play the part society had written for her. She didn't glance over her shoulder. She didn't look for validation. Instead, she raised her head not in pride, but in defiance of a system that had tried in every way possible to shrink her. That's when a reporter violating protocol blurted from across the barricades, "Congresswoman Crockett. Any final comment for the public?" She turned only slightly, her voice low, but sharp, meant not for headlines but for hearts. "You can choose silence, but don't let anyone force you into silence and call it dignity." Then she kept walking. No smile, no wave, just forward motion, slow, steady, unshakable. Because the courtroom had not crowned her. The Constitution had not given her a crown. Her truth had not been polished for media cycles or campaign donations. Her win was something harder to earn and impossible to buy the right to speak when others demand you swallow your voice for comfort's sake. And that's what made her dangerous not to the law, but to the culture that had normalized submission in heels and called it elegance. She walked through the rotunda like it was her first time seeing it. The same hall that once echoed with whispered judgments now stood as a corridor of memory. She had walked in weeks ago as the target of a calculated humiliation. Now she walked out as a reminder you cannot shame someone who knows their worth. Inside her mind, she replayed the key moments, not the insults, but the silence that followed when truth finally shattered pretense. Melania's face when the judge rendered the verdict. The gasps when the photo emerged. The quiet, visceral shift in the room when no one, not even the opposition, could justify the system that had tried to cage her in contracts, camera angles, and fake respectability. But Jasmine didn't indulge in revenge. She wasn't here to crush a name. She was here to break a chain that had looped through decades of public women being told they were most valuable when they smiled, agreed, and stayed silent about the men who wrote the rules. A chain that used power, media, and image to turn real pain into photo ops and real injustice into contracts. She reached the end of the building. The giant glass doors reflected her like a mirror. Not the surface-level version, the polished hair, the sharp suit, But the woman beneath, tired, tested, and triumphant in the quietest, most dangerous way. Not triumphant because she won, triumphant because they couldn't shut her up. Outside the afternoon, wind caught her coat and flared it slightly behind her. The sky was clear, crisp, unforgivingly honest like her. She didn't flinch. She let it hit her face. Let the cold remind her this was still the real world, that there would be more battles, more contracts, more people who tried to use words like dignity to mean don't embarrass the powerful. She crossed the plaza alone, no security detail, no entourage, just a black notebook in her hand and a message in her heart. A few feet ahead, someone, maybe a clerk, maybe a spectator, watched her with stunned respect. They didn't speak, just nodded as if to say, I saw what you did. I get it now. And that was enough. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't need everyone to understand her. She just needed enough people to realize that dignity isn't silence under pressure, it's truth under fire. When she reached the edge of the street, her phone buzzed. An aide texted, "We got requests for MSNBC, NPR, Good Morning America. Everyone wants the post-verdict interview." She stared at the screen for a moment, then powered it off. There would be no press tour, no victory lap. Not today. Because Jasmine knew something most politicians forget: you don't speak truth for applause. You speak it because someone else can't. She turned the corner, disappearing from sight. The courthouse faded behind her, not as a monument to law, but as a battlefield she had walked through without surrendering to the seduction of status. And as she walked on head high, expression steady, she became something bigger than a headline. She became the counter-example. The woman who said no when she was supposed to say thank you. The voice that said enough when the world told her to whisper. The figure that made silence expensive again. And in that final, wordless walk, she told a deeper story, one that no court record could capture. That in the end, the greatest power is not to win with noise, but to walk away unbroken, untouched by the systems that tried to shape you into something smaller. She didn't leave as a victor. She left as a mirror, one that forced the world to reckon with what it sees when a woman refuses to be quiet, even when the cost is everything. And for those watching from behind closed doors or within their own silent contracts, she left behind more than a ruling. She left behind permission to speak, to fight, to walk out not smiling, not grateful, but free. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a case. She reclaimed the right to define what dignity means. And sometimes that definition is best delivered not with a speech or a headline, but with the sound of footsteps walking away from the very stage they tried to build for your silence. And when the courtroom door closed behind her, it wasn't applause Jasmine Crockett heard, it was silence. A different kind of silence. Not the kind forced on her by contracts or public expectations, but the kind that follows a storm calm, sobering and honest. She had not won because she was louder. She had won because she refused to be muted. Because every step she took in that trial wasn't about proving herself right, but about making sure women like her wouldn't have to fight this same battle alone again. Her victory didn't rest in headlines or dollar amounts. It rested in the simple truth that power, when unchecked, becomes poison and silence becomes complicity. The truth is, this isn't just about Jasmine. It's about what we as a society reward and what we punish. We praise silence when it makes others comfortable. We call submission grace. We brand courage as disrespect. But dignity is not compliance. Strength is not silence. And truth is not meant to be palatable. It's meant to be told, especially when it shakes the room. Too many have been taught to wear silence like a second skin. Too many women have signed contracts with smiles dressed up censorship as respect and were told to sit beside power without ever speaking to it. Jasmine tore that image apart without shouting, without vengeance. She did it with facts, with questions, and with a voice rooted in something deeper than politics, integrity. And for that, she paid a price. But what she gave back was worth far more, a new model of what justice can look like when it doesn't wear a suit of silence. So what now? Now we look inward. We ask hard questions. Who are we silencing in our homes, our offices, our legislatures? Whose voices are we ignoring because they speak a little too sharply, a little too soon, or a little too often? If this story moved, you don't just clap change. Speak when it's risky. Stand up when you're alone. Call out injustice when it's dressed in pearls and suits. And when someone tells you to be quiet for the sake of unity or civility or decorum, remember Jasmine. She didn't break Melania. She broke the mold. And now it's your turn. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.